What's going on, y'all? I wanted to talk about kind of what's been going on in, I don't know, I guess I would say pop culture or even just rap culture right now, um, with these moguls, and it kind of started off with me viewing Dame Dash's Breakfast Club interview and me just really recollecting, what I'm saying, my own personal experiences with Dame Dash, right? Like now, my manager, former manager, whatever, Dan Salamito. I remember when we were in undergrad at Penn, one of his first jobs out of school, or really, I want to say he was a senior or he was just about to graduate. Matter of fact, no, it was his first job right out of school, was working with Dame when he went to start DDMG, Dame Dash Music Group. And he had an imprint at Def Jam. I want to say it was at Def Jam, or it was somehow through Russell Simmons. He got distribution through Russell Simmons somehow, I want to say. Um, and it might have been through Universal or Def Jam, one or the other. I just remember he had started his imprint. The Rockefeller thing was over. DJ Clark Kent was his head of A&R. And Dan had taken a job with Dame to be one of his four executive assistants. And I remember Dan's job specifically was A, to kind of work the music side of things. B, kind of deal with some of the stuff that Dame was starting to get into as far as creative control and the art gallery. I think it was DD 172 that he was, launching in New York. But then the other thing he was tasked with doing is kind of being a babysitter for Boogie, right? Dame's son. And then the other thing he was kind of doing was just, kind of everyday um, executive assistant tasks, right? And I remember Dan was like, "You got to get on the train. You got to come up here and meet Dame. You got to rap for Dame. You got to rap for Clark. We're gonna try to somehow get you into the system." And I remember I take the train. I skipped class. I took the train from Philly all the way to New York, which isn't that bad. I get up there around like, I don't know, maybe like 11 a.m. You know, Dan was just like, "Man, just come hang out at the office, right? You just hang out at the office for a while. Eventually, Dame's eventually gonna ask what you do and why you're here." And at that point, you're gonna rap for him. You're gonna rap for him. You're gonna rap for Clark, and we just gonna gauge. We just gonna see how it go. You know. So go up there, man. I probably got up there again midday. I'm there. I'm at the offices. It's a smaller office within a bigger building, but I was at their offices, kind of chilling out. Met Dame's other assistants. Met Clark Kent. Met a bunch of people. Um, Kicked it with a few people I knew who already were in New York that I went to school with. It wasn't probably until maybe like 9 at night that I actually met with Dame. And I remember his whole thing was like, when he met me, he was like, "Oh, this is one of Dan's is one of your little friends. He's an Ivy League guy. Like, was he why does he want to rap?" I remember that being like his initial sort of indictment of me. It was just like, I mean, he didn't know my name, he didn't know where I was from, he knew nothing about me. He just knew that if Dan was managing me and we went to school together, that I was some Ivy League kid and he didn't really want to hear what I had to say. At least in that regard. He was like, "Why don't you go do some fly shit? Why don't you go try to be in finance or own a business or start a hedge fund or something? Like, why you want to rap? Like, you don't got to rap." Eventually though, he asked me where I was from, when he found out I was from Chicago, and then we got deeper into conversation, and he realized I really was from the city, that I wasn't, a suburban kid or some trust fund kid or whatever. And he started telling me about his experiences with Kanye, and how he saw the launch. He saw before everybody else that Kanye was going to get to where he was getting, and then that was inspiring to me. But I just remember sitting there with him for a solid 2 hours with him just talking. I didn't even get a chance to rap. I did rap for Clark Kent, but I just remember at that point in time, Dame was this larger than life figure who I associated with my own childhood and my own coming of age in hip hop, and associating him with Jay-Z, and seeing him in the Big Pimpin' video pouring out Cristal on the boat, and just doing their thing with in a major way, right? And that was iconic to me, and because of that, I was willing to sit all day and wait for Dame, whether I got the rap for him or not. I was willing to take his critique and criticism. I was willing to kind of sit and listen to him hold court and tell stories. I want to say I even met up with him again in LA later that year. No, the next year there was a Grammy party that was happening for Kanye for his first kind of Grammy run. And I met up with Dame again, and I remember he told me I was, that he thought I was fly, that I had some like Chicago streetwear shit on, and he was really like, "Oh man, I ain't never seen that. Where you get it from?" And I remember telling him I had a piece from the Fly store on. He was like, asked me where I got it from, and I was telling him about Dave Jeff, and I was telling him about Fashion Geek and some of the other homies in Chicago that was doing their thing. And he was cool. He was like, "Man, y'all might be on to something with this hipster stuff. Like y'all like the new hipsters." Like, you know. And it's funny he said that, because it ended up being that, the stuff we were making with Kids in the Hall ended up being branded as hipster rap. But I say all that to say is that I feel like there's been somewhat of a fall from grace, right? And I was thinking about it, and I don't think that fall from grace is exclusive to Dame Dash, right? So I grew up on the south side of Chicago in the 90s, and that's right when hip hop is becoming this like global power. And I remember watching Diddy, or Puff, however you want to call him, with Mace on these yachts. I remember Russell Simmons turning Def Jam into this big empire, and him having Def Comedy Jam, him having Fat Farm, him having all these businesses, and being looked at as kind of like this symbol of black excellence that you could achieve through hip hop. He was on the cover of Black Enterprise magazine. I remember that magazine being in my parents' office in the waiting room. And I remember Dame Dash barking on radio shows about ownership and entrepreneurship. And I remember Suge Knight moving around with a cigar in his mouth, and being the CEO who got Pac out of jail and had a 20 to $50 million deal with Interscope, and just this CEO warlord mentality that existed within the industry. For me, as a young black boy who loved rap music and dreamed of breaking in the industry myself, these men weren't just entrepreneurs; they were mythical, man. They were um, icons, and their success seemed intoxicating at a time when my schools were uh, not necessarily interested in young people who wanted to sort of um, be bigger than the system, right? And enter into the music industry or do something in entertainment. And then also just watching my neighborhood, in many ways, maybe not my own block and my own household, but my neighborhood of South Shore wrestling with poverty and police. And, these black men seemed to own the world. They were stylish, they were loud, they were confident, they had money, they had the cultural capital. The world seemed to bend to their will. And to me, that was proof that like hip hop could be more than a hobby or a hustle. Like it could build a mogul, right? And that vision shaped me before I was a professor, right? I was a rapper, and I studied how these moguls branded themselves and how they use bravado and turn that into a strategy. And when I got my opportunity to enter into Chicago's hip hop scene, despite most people viewing my music as being backpack rap, right? I still wanted to maintain some of that energy that I saw in those videos and in those albums that I grew up on. And I wanted to carry myself with the same similar aura of invincibility. But there's always a danger in the myths that we construct. I think, on the one end, I think as a part of the Chicago scene, I saw young artists channel their energy and turn themselves into stars. But I also saw like a toxic masculinity that we started to celebrate at all costs. These empires that we looked up to, they rested on toughness, control, excess. Vulnerability often was not allowed. And in hindsight, I'm realizing that women and workers paid the price for that culture. Um, for years, I didn't really want to wrestle with that. That was my wife. My wife's texting me in the middle of this video, but I'm gonna keep going, and I'm just gonna face the consequences later. And I never really wanted to look closely at that part of the story. I wanted to preserve the innocence of my early hip hop dreams and that masculine energy. Um, the truth is, even in my own rap career, I wrestled with moral quandaries about how women were supposed to be treated at video shoots, on tour. Even in my lyrics, there were these unspoken rules that encourage objectification, normalize disrespect. And I went along with some of it because that's the culture that I wanted to enter. I wasn't an angel, but my own choices were shaped by some of the currents of masculinity that made moguls so alluring. Reflecting on them now means interrogating myself as well. Right. And even as I became a mentor, I started working in the community and I started working with younger artists. Those contradictions followed me. I would give students Russell Simmons' autobiography, Life or Death, as a guide to ambition and vision. That book guided me as a young man. Simmons' story showed me how an outsider could build institutions and bring hip hop from the margins to the mainstream. But today, the weight of those allegations against him, that same book feels complicated. The words haven't changed, but my understanding of power has, right? And as a professor teaching race, gender, and media, I can no longer ignore the contradictions. And the recent unraveling of many of the moguls that I grew up kind of idolizing has made it impossible not to confront them. Now, to go back to Dame Dash, right? His appearance on the Breakfast Club brought this into sharp focus. He was once this defiant partner to Jay-Z. My wife still texting me. um, you know, he was this defiant partner to Jay-Z, always brash, unapologetic. In that interview, though, his anger felt kind of untethered. He's speaking about, you know, folks kind of mentioning him possibly having financial struggles and losing control of what he had helped create. And watching him spar with Charlemagne the God wasn't really a fun. I mean, it was entertaining, but it wasn't really fun to see as someone who looked up to him as a mogul and someone who embodied ownership. And now he looked like a man who was wrestling in his own myth. Now, if we get to Diddy, his trajectory is even more painful to witness. For decades, he was sort of the blueprint for the hip hop mogul. He formed, a music label, fashion brands, television shows. He dominated every lane. His success suggested to me hip hop could not only compete with, but could surpass corporate America. But now, him having this federal trial, charges of sex trafficking, racketeering, that shine that he used to have on him is no longer really there, right? With the more we hear about, his private life, the more um, we're pointing to a system where these power insulated moguls didn't have any accountability, right? And many of the folks around them were complicit, often at the expense of women whose stories were ignored for years. Russell Simmons' exile sort of completes this picture. He was the elder statesman of hip hop business. And Simmons helped, carry the culture in so many ways. But as the Me Too movement hits, his allegations of sexual assault and harassment forced him to retreat. And so while I see him in Bali sort of doing his own thing and kind of creating his own existence outside of America, and I'm also watching him having arguments with his daughter online. A lot of this stuff represents the moral fracture that occurs when power and patriarchy sort of entwine too tightly. Then there's Suge Knight, who, often, is left out of this conversation about moguls because he's long been, you know, stubbornly associated with his intimidating factor, right? But he ends up in prison, right? And he was always the person who, um, served as sort of this person who seemed to hover over others, but that dominance did not lead to his liberation. It led to collapse. So for someone like me who saw these men as aspirational figures, their downfalls provoked this sort of grief in me. They remind me of contradictions within hip hop that I have to teach on an everyday basis. Hip hop is a culture born of resistance and creativity, yet it has often been seduced by the very patriarchal and capitalist logics it set out to resist. And the Mogul archetype was both empowering and damaging. It showed us the Black youth could own, create, and lead, but it also normalized exploitation and misogyny as the cost of doing business. Now, as a scholar, I think about complicity. My book, Hip Hop Civics, it talks about how rap song making can be used in classrooms as a tool for learning and imagination. That work is rooted in my own journey, going from an artist to being a professor. But that journey also means admitting how I once consumed this mogul mythology without any hard questions. We're talking about Diddy saying can't stop, won't stop, right? I was inspired by that. When Dame was yelling at folks on backstage about ownership, I saw vision. I ain't see the ego. I admired them, but I ignored their behavior and what it revealed about the cost of power. But moguls don't fall alone, right? Like they were protected by fans, by media, by industries that prefer profit to accountability. We celebrated their audacity while ignoring their harm. The complicity even extended to those who became critics and scholars. And through those kind of rose-colored glasses, we wanted heroes to write about, and in wanting them, we ignored the warning signs. So I'm wondering what happens now. So when I talk to my students, I don't want to abandon the desire for Black excellence, entrepreneurship, or cultural sovereignty, but we got to be able to challenge these structures and carve out spaces that are still safe. And we need new archetypes for leadership. The mogul, as we once imagined him, the hyper masculine empire builder who treats people as collateral, is no longer tenable. And we need figures who embody transparency, accountability, and an ethics of care. We got to show young people that vulnerability is not a weakness, but a strength. But this is more than just discarding hip hop or rejecting the joy that I felt when I was growing up. It's about holding on to cultural innovations while refusing to excuse the harms. The moguls of my youth taught me ambition, but they also taught me that ambition without ethics, right? It can corrode one's person. I look at my students and I think about who they follow now on TikTok, YouTube, and Twitch. And I think about how the cloud economy sometimes rewards dysfunction the same way the mogul economy once rewarded domination. And I remind them that the stories we celebrate shape the futures we believe are possible. If we want better futures, we have to tell better stories, right? Now, hip hop gave me my dreams, and these moguls gave me a vision of possibility, but middle age and scholarship have given me perspective. To honor the culture now means telling the whole story, not just the triumphs, but the toxic or the toxicities, not just the myths, but also the consequences. And it means asking how we can create models of Black leadership that inspire without injury and that liberate without dominating. Um, and so I guess to tie this up in a bow, I'm just thinking to myself the falls of Diddy and Dame and even Russell and possibly and if you want to throw Suge in there, you could throw him in there too. That's not necessarily the end of hip hop entrepreneurship because people are still out here building businesses and getting money. But this is the end of a very particular myth as it pertains to capitalist gain within hip hop. And perhaps for the sake of the culture and generations to come, it's time that the myth finally falls away. And that was on my mind. I'm gonna get back to my wife before she yells at me about whatever it is she's been texting me about. But feel free to drop your comments below, and I would love to hear from you all about what you think about this.